Chapter 26 of Household Puzzles by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 26. Laces and Duty. Tom Randolph sat in the dining room with his chair tipped back, his hat drawn over his eyes, and his feet on the rounds of another chair. Contrary to Mrs. Munroe's code of morals, Tom's new start in life had not yet made him a careful observer of all the rules of propriety. The less religion does for a person's own life and habits, the more certain is that person to expect it to work a sudden and complete transformation in the habits of one who has very recently professed to be governed by its precepts. Tom was deep in thought, which, to judge by the expression on his face, was not very pleasant. Mrs. Munroe was plaiting a crepe ruffle, and Maria was setting the table for the next morning's breakfast. The household had narrowed down. The summer and early autumn had gone from them, so also had Faith. Contrary to the opinions of some good people, she held it to be her privilege to make life as endurable as she could, and to stay among the rooms that had echoed to the constant patter of Pearlie's little feet made the weight of pain seem heavier, so she went away. Maria, as she set the table, sighed a little as she left vacant the end where Faith and Pearlie used to sit. Maria missed them sadly. Tom looked up at last, pushed his hat back a little, and smiled faintly. Very few smiles had Tom Randolph to bestow. One may rally from a heavy sorrow which God has sent, and smile brightly even between the tears. But a weight of self-remorse over a sin that has brought lifelong sorrow to someone, a sorrow that but for you might not be, such pain to a young man like Tom Randolph cuts deeply and leaves little heart for smiling. "I'm a gentleman of leisure," he said to Maria, and she gave a little start of dismay at the news. You must forgive Maria. She did not want her brother to sell liquor for a living, but she kept the family purse, and Tom paid his board. "Couldn't you wait a little?" she said, deprecatingly. "I didn't see how I could, Maria. I couldn't sell any more liquor." "I'm sure I don't see why," Helen said, sharply. "You have sold it for some months, and I should think a few days longer would make very little difference. It would be an improvement on coming home to father to be supported." Now this was precisely what Helen herself had done. One wouldn't have supposed that she would have condemned it in another. Tom controlled the impulse to tell her so, and answered simply, "I felt that I could not sell another drop of liquor." "Well," Maria said, with a long-drawn sigh, "I suppose you are right, and I shall be glad enough that you are out of it when you get in somewhere else. But the week's accounts won't match very well now." "I know," he said with a gloomy face. "The burden rests heavily. I'm afraid it will be some time before I can find employment. I've met with nothing but failures today." "Of course," Helen said, with a volume of significance in her tones. "You can't expect people to trust you." Tom's boots came down from the chair so suddenly that Helen said, with a nervous start, "Dear me, how rough you are!" But he said not a word. The outside door creaked slowly, and Mr. Randolph came in with weary step. Helen gave him the easy chair in which she had been sitting, and Maria brought his slippers. "How tired you look," she said, anxiously. "And you are late tonight, too. I think it is too bad that you have to do overwork." "Not often," he said feebly, and then he coughed sharply. "Father," said Tom, with the air of one who had something to communicate that was depressing, and the sooner it could be told and put away, the better. "I wish you needed an errand boy or porter or something of that sort at your store. I've thrown up my work and am an object of charity." Mr. Randolph put his tired hands on the armchair and drew himself up, and came with eager steps toward his son. "Thank God," he said, with trembling earnestness. "I thank him that this trouble is ended. I have felt it bitterly. I am a temperance man, you know, my son." Tom Randolph arose and stood beside his father. He towered above him. He rested one hand on his arm, and his voice trembled more than his father's had. "Father, I am a temperance man, too. I have signed a total abstinence pledge to-day. I hope to atone in a measure for the pain I have given you." "I'm sure I am very glad," Helen said, when both father and son had left the room. "As glad as any one can be, only one can't help wishing that his repentance had come a little earlier." Maria slammed the closet door. "If you ever get to heaven," she said irritably, "you will say, 'I can't help wishing I had come yesterday or waited until tomorrow. Things as they are never quite right in your estimation.'" Helen opened her eyes in wonder. "Dear me," she said plaintively, "what have I said now? I seem to be always saying something." "That's true," Maria murmured, and she banged the other closet door a little before she left the room. Tom came in search of her while she was in the pantry setting the cakes for breakfast. "Father was pleased with my leaving the saloon," he said, speaking a little wistfully. She turned toward him a bright face. "Of course he was," she said, heartily. "So am I. Only the world, the flesh, and the other one got the better of me for a little." "It is gloomy work for you, I know," he said, sadly. "It seems almost hopeless for me to try to get employment. At the best, there is very little doing, and my former experience and reputation are not flattering. If I were only a girl, I would have a chance to try at least." "A girl! Why, I thought it was more difficult for a girl to get work than a boy." "I suppose it is, generally speaking. But I know of a chance for a girl. Arthur and McAllister advertise for a clerk. I answered the advertisement this morning, but they informed me that they employed none but females at the lace counter." This conversation sent Maria to bed with wide-open eyes, that continued open far into the midnight. The result of which midnight musing was a conversation with Grace over the next morning's breakfast dishes. The conversation opened with her favorite expression. "There's no use in talking, Grace. Something has got to be done." "I know it," Grace said, meekly. There had been so much talking that she knew quite well what Maria meant, without explanation. That young lady, however, proceeded to explain. "Here's Helen on our hands to support, and Tom without anything to do, and father looking paler and coughing harder every night. It's time there was a chance." "Can you think of anything?" "Yes, 100 things. It is easier to think than to do. However, I'm going to try doing. Tom says there is a vacancy at Arthur and McAllister's, and I'm going this very morning to try for it. If I succeed, you'll have to keep house. You'll hate it, I know, but so do I hate lace. That's where the vacancy is, at the lace counter. If you can conceive of anything more stupid than puttering over boxes of lace from morning till night, I don't know what it can be. I'd rather bake griddle cakes or wash dishes, and I've no particular love for that employment either. However, tastes and feelings and things of that sort have all been ground up long ago in this house and eaten for daily bread." "I don't see how the house is ever going to get along without you," Grace said, dismay in her voice, in her eyes, all about her. "It is to get along with you the best way it can. I'm sure you can get us all something to eat if you try. Anyway, I can't much longer, without some money to get it with, and I know no other way but to go and earn some." There was one other way. Grace timidly suggested it. "If Helen would only apply for the vacant place." "Helen!" echoed Maria, in undisguised disdain. "I think I see her doing it. Why, bless your heart, child, don't you know it isn't genteel to sell lace? It is perfectly proper to live on a sick father. In fact, it is quite genteel to starve, if you do it gracefully. But the idea of one who has been connected with the Munroe family stooping to lace selling isn't to be thought of for a moment." I may as well say, just here, that no sooner were the dishes dried and marshaled into place than Maria put her plans into execution, and the firm of Arthur and McAllister being really in need, and being well acquainted with her father, she met with prompt success. Then commenced a series of martyrdom such as the Randolph family had hitherto not known. Such breakfasts as were shrinkingly brought before the miserable victims. Such dinners as they endured. Grace worked from dawn till dark and did her very best, but she really had no more affinity for cooking than a canary bird, and whatever other branches of business may be carried on successfully without a fair knowledge of and general interest in the details, housekeeping cannot. So the steak was burned or smoked, and the bread was sticky and sour, the pies were exasperating, and poor Grace came regularly to the table with cheeks aglow and 3 fingers done up in rags, burned or cut as the case might be. Maria's disgust sent her daily to the lace counter with a frowning face. She was sharp to the customers, and positively crabbed to sister clerks to such a degree that she more than once received a hint from headquarters that she must be more civil or lose her place. Despite all these grievances, the week's salary from the lace counter helped considerably in the family puzzle. So each girl stood her ground with the resolution that helps to make martyrs, though Grace retreated nightly under the bedclothes with red eyelids. One evening Maria plodded home from the store, through mud and rain, without either rubbers or umbrella waterproof she had not, and the consequence was sneezes and involuntary weeping out of one eye the next day. "There is no use in trying to thumb over lace today," she said to Grace, who was looking gravely at the greasy spider. "You'll just have to go in my place." "What, to the store?" Grace said, dropping the spider in her surprise. "Yes, of course. I believe you have cracked that. What is the use of being so careless? My head spins round like a top, and feels as large as the flour barrel, and as empty. Tell Mr. McAllister, with my compliments, that he won't have the pleasure of growling at me today." "But what will you do about the work?" "Why, I'll do it. Because I can't walk a mile in the rain, it doesn't follow that I can't do a little work in the kitchen. And I'll have a decent dinner once more, I venture to say." This last in an undertone. Then louder, "Will you try the store?" "Why, of course I'll try. But, Maria, I'm not sure that I shall succeed any better than I do at cooking." Maria tied a handkerchief around her aching head and mopped the kitchen floor. Grace rarely had time for mopping. Then she made some apple sauce for dinner that stayed in delightful quarters, a thing which Grace's apple sauce was never known to do. The dinner, though it was only baked potatoes and cold meat, was a success. For, be it known, there is a way to make utterly uneatable even baked potatoes and cold meat, and poor Grace knew that way. Then when at tea time Maria had sufficiently subdued eyes and nose so that she gave herself up to the pleasure of making a delicious creamy Johnny cake, the comfort of the Randolph family reached a height unknown for weeks. As for Grace, the day passed quietly. The lace was neither greasy nor sticky, 2 things which she abhorred. The rain prevented much sale, but in the arrangement of the boxes she proved useful, saying, after but a lesson or 2, "I can tell the real from the imitation now, I think." "How do you tell?" Mr. McAllister asked her, looking her through with keen eyes. "I don't know," she said with flushing face. "I haven't learned how to tell scientifically, only this feels real, and this one doesn't." "Never mind the science," he said, smiling a little, and then he left her to herself. 3 days Maria's cold held sway. The mopping and the Johnny cake proved to be not good for it. After that she went back to the store, and Grace, with a little softly sigh, put on her greasy apron, her work apron was always greasy, and took the dishcloth between her thumb and finger. Mr. Arthur, the senior partner, summoned Maria to the office. "Is your sister Grace, who has served us in your absence, a young lady of leisure?" "Not particularly," said Maria, smiling in spite of his dignity at the thought of poor Grace with her head in the oven, probably, at that moment. She is housekeeper for a family of 5. Oh, at your own home? Yes, sir. Mr. Arthur leaned his chin on his lead pencil and mused. Well, the fact is, he said at last, if you and Miss Grace could change places, it would perhaps be agreeable to all parties. She gave very general satisfaction in the store. The customers liked her, and the clerks like her very much. She is low-voiced and gentle in her movements, and she tells real and imitation laces by instinct, or in some other mysterious way. At least, she rarely fails. In short, Miss Randolph, she has an aptitude for the business, which, I may as well say, and you will excuse my frankness, I am always frank, you have not. Now, Miss Randolph, we are prepared to engage your sister permanently, and give her the full salary, which is $1 a week more than you have been receiving, if that will suit you. Engage her in my place, you mean? In your place. Personally, Mr. Arthur, I am delighted with the proposition, and I think Grace will approve. I quite agree with you that I have no aptitude for the business. I hate lace. I always hated things that could be copied so precisely that you had to feel of them to tell the real from the false. Nevertheless, after making this emphatic address, Maria went home in a good deal of amaze. Once or twice she laughed outright. It was very funny, certainly. Grace able to earn her own living, and she, Maria, who had been useful and practical ever since she was born, not. There are different ways of doing things, I suppose, she said aloud and quite humbly for her. And this little episode did Maria Randolph good. Also, it did Grace good. There was a recognized place for her in the world then, even if it was only behind a lace counter. She felt more self-reliant. The wild, chaotic kind of living that had been in vogue in the Randolph family subsided. The dishes retired to their respective shelves, and comfort reigned once more. And people liked to buy laces at Arthur and McAllister's. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of Household Puzzles by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 27. Storm and Moonshine. What a horrid evening, Mrs. Munroe said, with a shiver, and she drew a little black shawl closer about her shoulders. It rains all the time nowadays. They were all in the little dining room, Mr. Randolph in his easy chair, in dressing gown and slippers, feebly trying to look over some accounts, stopping every few minutes to wipe his forehead and his thin hands, for the constant little cough produced a perspiration that was cold and clammy and disagreeable. In some way Mr. Randolph must have relief from that office. In some way he would soon have it. If no other channel opened, the restful grave would come to his aid. Maria felt this, and she chopped her meat for the morning hash, with her face all gathered in a frown. Life was hard to Maria, and she made it harder than she need. Why must she persist in carrying all her burdens for herself? Grace had drawn as near the light as she could, and held in her lap the only brightness that the room contained, some crimson worsteds. They kept a case of fancy articles in the store, and Grace made pretty trifles by instinct. She had made the happy discovery that she could help to replenish that case with great advantage to her own purse. In short, Grace was in a fair way to earn her own living, and it was only busy, practical Maria who was working hard and earning nothing. So she thought. But who will be kind enough to estimate how much those people really earn who spend their lives in skillfully contriving how to save the earnings of other people? Ermina, on the other side of the stand, was straining her eyes over black ruffles. There was no let-up to ruffles that she had to prepare for the next day's campaign. They were not always black ruffles, and the light was not always so dim as on this evening. All the gloom had concentrated itself. The Randolph expenses were being narrowed to a low scale. They had actually reached that pitiful point when an extra kerosene lamp, when they were all gathered in one room of an evening, was a luxury not to be thought of. So they sat close and strained their eyes over one. Helen was the only unoccupied person. She had affected to read the morning paper until she pronounced the light no better than a tallow candle. "I wonder you don't introduce one into your economy," she said scornfully to Maria, and that young lady answered, with a grave face, "Do you suppose it would be cheaper?" Helen vouchsafed no answer, and the silence that seemed to possess them all was renewed. Tom came suddenly in at the side door, letting in with him a gust of wind and rain, and leaving the door open a crack, as men are apt to do, while he rushed through to the kitchen with his dripping umbrella. Helen shivered and drew further into her shawl, and Maria pushed the door to with a bang. "You always leave doors open after you," she said a little fretfully, as Tom emerged from his wet overcoat and came back to the dining room. "I wanted to give you a taste of outside life, so that you would better appreciate the comforts of your position," he said cheerily, drawing a chair near his father. Helen sniffed. "Comforts!" she said sarcastically. "Why, yes, there is a marked difference between this room and the street. It rains in torrents, and it is the darkest night I ever saw. Well, I am ready for congratulations. I have found employment at last." Maria looked up from her hash with a gleam of satisfaction. Grace said, "Oh, good!" and Ermina asked with interest, "What is it?" "Before I tell that, I must remind you that I have been for more than 3 weeks now searching right and left for something to do, and the case was really growing desperate." Mr. Randolph dropped the paper on which he was figuring, and the pencil in his hand trembled as he said nervously, "You have not gone back to that saloon, have you, Thomson?" "No, sir." There was an emphatic ring in Tom's voice. "It is a respectable business this time. Only, Maria, if you board me, you will have to give me very prompt breakfasts. I'm to be on hand for the 7 o'clock car." "In the capacity of driver, I presume?" Mrs. Munroe said this for the utmost sarcasm, but Tom's answer was prompt. "That's it, exactly. How came you to guess so soon?" "Why, Tom Randolph!" Grace said, looking aghast. "Nonsense," said Maria. "You'll believe anything, Grace. Do tell us, Tom, what you have to do with the 7 o'clock car?" "Drive the horses attached to it," Tom said gravely. "Helen has guessed rightly. I am tired of idleness. Any work is better than that. And this is honest and decent." Up to this time Mrs. Munroe had not fully taken his meaning. The magnitude of his crime seemed too great for her mind to compass. She sat looking at him with absolute disgust in her face, and her voice was actually tremulous as she said, "Tom Randolph, I should think you had disgraced your father sufficiently. I don't know what he has done that he should be so utterly disappointed and disgraced in his son. I hope this will not break him down utterly." "Helen!" Mr. Randolph's voice had that peculiar ring in it that they as children had heard but a few times in their lives. "Helen, I am proud of him. I am glad when I see any one sufficiently independent to rise above foolish grades and distinctions. So far am I from being disgraced, I think I never was so sure of a successful future for my son as I am at this moment. Moral courage is something that I never had very much of, but it is something that I admire and respect." "There is no accounting for people's tastes," Helen said coldly, even haughtily. Then she took up her paper and professed to read. Someway no one liked to express an opinion after that, and the sewing and chopping went on quietly. Tom left them to look after kindlings for the morning fire. Ermina sewed to the end of her ruffle, and looked wearily over at the pile on the lounge waiting to be sewed. Should she, or should she not, try to do more that evening? She was not obliged to sew in the evenings, but they were hurried. They always are hurried in dressmaking establishments. There never seems to come a time when the world is clothed. And it expedited matters so much in the next day's rush to have yards and yards of work turned down and basted. But Ermina was unusually tired this evening, body and heart. She pushed her chair back a little from the light, and shaded her weary eyes with her hand. Life looked unutterably dreary to her. The rain pelting unceasingly against the window, and the wind howling around the keyhole, served to deepen her sense of gloom. Through her fingers she could get peeps of her father's face, and she felt not exactly shocked at its pallor. The sight had grown too common to come as a shock, but it hurt her with a new pain. How feeble he looked, and how puzzled he seemed over the miserable figures. What a daily perplexity life must be to him, instead of having the rest and peace about it that a man of his years needed. The miserable lamp that smoked a little, as kerosene lamps frequently do, added to the general sense of discomfort and discouragement which possessed her. They were even too poor to have gaslight. They were growing poorer. She worked hard at her new business and carefully saved her earnings, yet there seemed to be less to live on than there used. There was less. Mr. Randolph's weakness and feebleness had grown upon him to such an extent that he had relinquished of necessity one duty after another, and, of course, his salary had grown proportionately smaller, and the family were coming to know that it really was only by courtesy that his place was kept at all. There was certainly enough to justify a feeling of apprehension as to the future, yet Ermina had of late been able to lift herself somewhat above it all, to trust her life and the lives of her kindred in the Father's hand. To-night, though, it was nearer despair than trust. She felt utterly cast down and forsaken, as if there were no brightness anywhere. Those ruffles over on the lounge waiting for her seemed like so many imps of darkness ready to sting her. She hated them, and the life stretching drearily out before her, filled with ruffles to hem and gather and plait, looked unutterably horrible. I want you to understand that I don't justify Ermina for being in this state of mind. Of course it was unreasonable and silly. It was no more right than it was for you to be cross all the morning because the steak was tough and the coffee cold when you came to breakfast. I have no doubt it was unchristian. So are 1/8 of the things that you have said and done today. But I insist that it was very human, and Ermina was an intensely human girl, with like passions and failings with yourself. Whether she hadn't a very little more to try her than you have had today, judge ye. The doorbell pealing through the house startled the family with the sudden sense of a something breaking rudely in on their quiet, which people feel when they have allowed themselves to sink into the depths of gloomy reverie. Helen dropped the paper with an exclamation. "Who on earth can be coming here in such a storm? It must be urgent business." Tom, who had been heard banging about the upper hall, now came down to answer the bell. They heard him show someone into the parlor. Then he came to the dining-room door and put his head in. "A messenger for you, Ermina." Then he vanished. "Someone about those dreadful dresses," Ermina said with a sigh. "They would come to look after their ruffles if it rained icicles." "Don't keep the poor victim long, whoever it is, or he will freeze." This was Maria's parting sentence. The dimmest of smoking lamps served to make the darkness of the little parlor visible. The stove had not even been set up yet. It was not late in the season, and people would not expect you to have a fire when there was no stove in which to make it. By dint of close looking, Ermina discovered a shadow in the dimness. It was tall and wore an overcoat. She went toward it with dignity, wondering at its errand. There was no mistaking the sudden light in her eyes as she neared it, and it spoke, though it said simply, "Good evening, Miss Ermina." She knew the voice, and there was pleasure mingling with the surprise with which she said, "Mr. Harper!" "Now you are wondering why I came out in the storm," he said, when they were comfortably seated. "I see the wonderment in your eyes, and I am not surprised at it. I confess to you that it doesn't look like a sane proceeding. But I had a reason, and it can be explained in a very few words. I wanted to see you." "That is remarkable," Ermina said with a little laugh. "I didn't know any one was ever in that state." "Did you not?" he said earnestly. It is becoming a chronic state with me. I have been thinking about it nearly all this day, thinking about it and praying over it, and to-night I have braved the storm, resolved to tell you the whole story." A dozen times they wondered in the dining room who could be keeping Ermina so. Then, as Tom did not appear again, they gave over wondering, and went their several ways. Helen had been asleep when Ermina, who shared her room, pushed open the door, and brought her dim little lamp into the darkness. She set it softly down and went to the window. The rain had ceased, and dozens of stars were twinkling. Helen popped up her head from among the pillows. "Where in the world have you been?" she asked in wonderment. "I've been nowhere," Ermina answered with shining eyes. "What a change there is in the weather. Do you know, Helen, the stars are shining, and it looks as though it would never rain again." "Who wanted you?" asked Helen, ignoring the stars. "And whoever it was, why didn't they spend the night?" "Why, it isn't but a few minutes." "A few minutes! It was nearly 10 o'clock when I came upstairs. It must be 11 now." "Oh, no," Ermina said, quickly. "It couldn't be." "Well, who was it?" Thus pressed, Ermina's reluctant tongue succeeded in forming the words, "Mr. Harper." Helen echoed them. "Mr. Harper! What in the name of common sense did he want? Couldn't he have chosen a lovelier night for his errand?" "He is not afraid of the rain," Ermina said, evasively. "I should think not, nor of cold, nor of you, either. It is a wonder you did not freeze. His errand must have been very pressing. What did he want?" "I declare if there isn't the moon!" Ermina said, eagerly. "I didn't know it rose so late. I believe I had forgotten that there was one. Oh, how beautiful it is!" Mrs. Helen Munroe raised herself on one elbow, and spoke impatiently. "Ermina Randolph, I have asked you 3 times what Mr. Harper wanted. If you intend to tell me, I wish you would let the stars and the moon alone, and do so." Ermina dropped the curtain, and went over to the glass and began to take the pins out of her hair. Her cheeks were very glowing. "He wanted me," she said slowly, almost reverently. Mrs. Munroe sat up straight and looked at her. "You?" she repeated, intense amazement in her voice. "What do you mean?" "I mean that, with all that it implies. I do not wonder that you are astonished. You can not be so much as I was. To think that God had that waiting for me, coming to me all the while. And only this very evening I felt that my life was desolate. I have been a very untrustful child, Helen. I wonder that he has had patience with me." Mrs. Munroe fixed the pillows under her head and lay down without another word. The lamp had been out for an hour, and Ermina had been turning herself over in the bed for nearly that length of time, when her sister made her first comment on the evening's revelation. "Well, I think he took a very rainy night for it." End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of Household Puzzles by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 28. A New Start. Very soon thereafter there was another wedding in the Randolph family, utterly unlike the first one. So unlike, so ill-befitting in Helen's estimation the dignity of Ermina's coming position, that she went around for weeks beforehand with her forehead drawn in a row of wrinkles, and in kitchen and pantry held endless, hopeless discussions with Maria. As for Ermina, she did in many things just what people are not given to doing under the same circumstances. For instance, she kept her place in the sewing room up to the very last week of her stay at home. Her reasons, therefore, were simple and conclusive. "I've nothing very special to do. I'm not going to have 16 flounced and plaited silk dresses. My wardrobe is to be simple, from taste partly, from necessity a great deal, and I need all the money I can earn." A morning wedding, no guests, no wedding cake. Over each of these 3 movements Helen exhausted herself and the patience of those around her with argument. An evening wedding was so much more tasteful and stylish." "As to taste," Maria said, "that, of course, was a matter of taste, and tastes differed." "And as to style," Ermina chimed in, "I'm not stylish, you know, don't aim to be." "But Mr. Harper was," Helen said, "very stylish, and immensely wealthy. She thought some little regard ought to be paid to his position." The mention of Mr. Harper's name always produced a softened and quieted tone of voice in Ermina. So while Maria answered with unusual sharpness that "Mr. Harper's wealth was not supposed to pay the wedding expenses, and his position was strong enough to take care of itself," Ermina said gently that "Mr. Harper entirely approved of the arrangements. Indeed, they were of his own planning." "Well, I must say you are queer creatures," Helen said, with lifted eyebrows and vexed voice. "I don't know after all but you are well matched. One would suppose if people had any friends they would like to see them about them on their wedding day. But, as Maria says, there is no accounting for people's tastes." There was a mixture of sharpness and humility in Ermina's answer. "I don't at this moment think of an individual in this town, outside of our own immediate family, that I care particularly ever to see again. It is a mortifying fact, and I don't doubt that it is my own fault, but it is a fact nevertheless. I'm sure I hope never to have to own it in regard to any other home of mine." "No danger," Maria said grimly. "Mr. Harper's millions would secure plenty of friends." Maria's was, however, a sort of satisfied grimness. She was very willing to have millions come into the family, especially when in their train they brought every other qualification. Her tussle with poverty had been too long, and her heart was too unselfish, not to feel genuine joy that one of the family had emerged into the sunlight, especially when that one was Ermina, decidedly her favorite sister, and more especially when the sunshine was of Mr. Harper's own bringing. She thoroughly believed in Mr. Harper. "There are two ways of getting married," she said in a burst of confidence to Grace over their night toilet. "Helen married the handsome house, and the lace curtains, and the silver tea set, and the diamond ring, and plenty of silk dresses, and Horace Munroe thrown into the background as a kind of awkward necessity. Ermina, now, is going to marry Mr. Harper because the houses and the jewels come with him. I guess she is quietly glad whenever she happens to think of them, but it's Mr. Harper, anyhow. I recommend you to follow the latter example. It sounds more like the marriage service." "I'm not going to be married at all," said sleepy Grace. "I'm going to stay at home and keep house for father." Maria shrugged her shoulders. "My patience, I pity father," she said significantly, and the next instant was glad that Grace was too nearly asleep to feel the point of the sentence. Maria was nearly always sorry for her sharp points after she had made them. "But I don't see why you can't have a little cake like decent people," said Helen, returning freshly to the charge after a night's rest. "Who ever heard of a wedding without any wedding cake?" "What is the use of it?" Ermina asked briskly. "If it were to be an evening entertainment, I suppose we should have to have it. But who wants to munch cake at 8 o'clock in the morning? I'm sure I would rather have a potato." "Such an unearthly hour," murmured Helen, in increasing disgust, and Ermina innocently reminded her that it was an hour later than usual. There was little use in discussions. Both Mr. Harper and Ermina seemed to be hopelessly set in their determination to ruffle the family life as little as possible. One little sentence escaped Ermina in conversation with Grace, with whom each sister was more apt to be confidential than with each other. "I would have liked to have a little more of a commotion, of course. Who wouldn't? It is not in human nature not to want to make a nice time when one is married. But we had such a dreadful time in getting over the expenses of Helen's wedding that I am determined to bring no more debts of that kind. I would rather have baked potatoes and salt for the wedding breakfast than to have father harassed with bills." Tom was dressing for the wedding, Though Helen disdainfully said she saw no use in dressing, they might as well wear their calico wrappers. But they didn't. Instead they put on their best dresses, and the table looked fresh and pretty, with no cake but doughnuts, but delicious coffee to drink with them. Tom needed assistance in the matter of a button, and was glad to find Maria at liberty for a minute to sew it on. During the operation he laughed outright at his own thoughts, and then proceeded to explain. One of my brother drivers came to me last night for a confidential chat. I wish you could have seen his puzzled and important face. He is that Jerry that you think is so good-natured. What do you think he wanted? I'm sure I don't know. This button has split in two, Tom. Well, here's another. I couldn't imagine what he was coming at. He called me aside and looked so important. He begged my pardon for troubling me. They are all remarkably polite to me. And he said that 4 or 5 of them had been having a time with their washerwoman because she didn't use starch enough. They're wonderfully particular fellows on Sunday. She ironed in wrinkles, too, he said, and then, after considerable stammering, he managed to get out that a number of them had been talking over the immaculateness of my linen, and had decided to get me to negotiate with my washerwoman, whoever she was, to see if she would do their work. The poor fellow was utterly crestfallen when I told him that my laundress was my sister. "They are letting that coffee boil over. I smell it," was Maria's lucid reply. "I knew something would happen if I came away. Is that all you want, Tom?" "All right, much obliged," and Maria went back to the breakfast. A rich brother-in-law is a very fine thing to have, but you can't eat him, nor make clothes out of him, so the summing up of the whole matter is that I must find something to do that will help support the family. And, Helen, you will have to keep house and do the cooking. Of course it was Maria who said this. "I'm sure I'm willing," Helen said drearily, "only I can't imagine what you will do." "I'll do something," Maria said, determination in her face and voice. Something besides a wedding had come to the family. Only the day after Ermina left them, Mr. Randolph, going to his office as usual, looking not paler nor more feeble than usual, so far as they could see, came from there an hour afterward in the carriage of his employer. Was supported on the arm of a brother clerk to his room. He had fainted at his post. "Nothing serious, I trust," the young man said, reassuringly, and the daughters hoped it wasn't, and told each other that he had been unusually fatigued and excited during the preparation for Ermina's departure. He needed rest. Tomorrow he would be better. But tomorrow came, and after a good many tomorrows had passed, they began gradually to realize that he would not go to the old seat in the counting room again. So there was Grace's salary in the store and Tom's wages as a streetcar driver to support the family. No wonder that even Helen awakened to the necessity of doing something. But what was it to be? Several days were spent in fruitless search, and it was after one of those days, when Mr. Randolph's cough had been more distressing than usual, that Maria, in a mood halfway between apathy and despair, washed the dishes by the light of a smoking kerosene lamp. It needed a new burner, but they were too poor to afford one. She was alone in the kitchen. Grace had returned to the store, and Helen was resting on the lounge in the sitting room after the wearying duties of the day, for Maria had been out all the afternoon engaged in her unsuccessful search for employment, and Helen had done the kitchen work with what patience and skill she could command for the occasion. Tom, in the woodshed, was whistling softly, and the tune he whistled suggested familiar words. Thus far the Lord hath led me on, thus far his power prolongs my days, and every evening shall make known some fresh memorial of his grace. Presently the whistling broke into actual words, and he sang, Much of my time has run to waste. Then he pushed open the kitchen door, with his arms full of kindlings. There is no truer line than that. He stopped his singing to say to Maria, "And yet, isn't it a queer world? I'm actually trying now, with all my might, to redeem the time. My work is honest, and I'm trying to be faithful, and I overheard Judge Morris tell his son Charlie, who used to be my chum, you know, that he was afraid I had gone to the dogs, that I was actually a streetcar driver." "The rest of my time is likely to run to waste," Maria said, dwelling moodily on the line quoted. Then she roused herself to respond to his remark. "I shouldn't care what Judge Morris thought, or his son Charlie either. I presume they considered you all right while you were a gentleman of leisure. Tom, how came you ever to decide to take that work to do?" "Well," said Tom, speaking reflectively, and depositing his kindlings in the box as he spoke, "indirectly, Peter Armstrong had as much to do with it as any one. You don't know, perhaps, what a queer fashion he has of reading the Bible? He discovered that there was a Peter in it, and he 'hunted him up,' as he says, and read about him. Sometimes lives a week on an idea of Peter Bibles. Sometimes it is a month before he takes up a new item. I have been immensely interested in his system. Now you know it is only a little while since I started out on a new plan of living, and something suggested to my mind the determination to be a whatsoever Christian." "A what?" said puzzled Maria. "A whatsoever Christian. I'm afraid I should have shrunken from it if I had comprehended in what ways it would lead me. I have been amazed a good many times already. Well, one morning the verse proved to be, 'Whatsoever thy hand findeth to do, do it with thy might.' It was after I had spent some weeks in looking for work, and that very morning I had not been away from the house 10 minutes, when I heard, in a curious sort of way, that they were having trouble with the car drivers, dismissed several. 'Whatsoever my hand findeth,' said I to myself. 'My patience,' said I. Why, I didn't think it would set me to driving car horses. But it was the only whatsoever that appeared to me that day, and by night I had decided it. I have not been sorry," said Tom, taking off his hat and brushing the thick hair from his forehead. "In fact, I think I can say I am glad, though the position has not been a particularly pleasant one." "It's a queer idea," Maria said, with a short little laugh. "But I think there is a good deal more energy than religion about it. I like that sort of motto." "Adopt it," said Tom, eagerly. "I wish you would. I think you would like it. And I'm sure I would like the way in which it would lead me." "I wouldn't be afraid of that," Maria said, loftily. "I'm no shirk. I wouldn't be a bit afraid to live out all the whatsoevers in the world." "Then try it," Tom said, with increasing earnestness. "Will you? I haven't the least doubt of your ultimate success if you will undertake it. Come, will you pledge yourself?" "Why, I presume I've always done it. I know I've done with my might whatsoever I had to do." "That isn't the first one," Tom said, significantly. Then he went back to get more kindlings. When the dishes were done and the kitchen in order, Maria went to the window and looked out into the moonlight, folding her arms on the window seat and staring out without seeing moonlight or stars or anything else but her own thoughts. "Tom," she said suddenly, as that person came in again, this time with a pail of water, "have those men, Jerry and those others you told me of, found a washerwoman to their mind yet?" "No," said Tom, laughing. "Isn't it queer that they should be so particular? They keep in a continual growl. That Jerry is engaged to be married, they say, and I presume that is why he wants much shining linen. Mine shines beautifully, they say." "Well, Tom, I'm going to put your whatsoever straight into practice. You tell them, to-morrow morning, that I will do their washing for them. This is Friday evening. I'll begin next week, and you can keep on the lookout for some more people who want washing done." Tom set his pail down so heedlessly that the water splashed over himself and the floor. "You can't mean it," he said, regarding her with an incredulous stare. "Yes, I can. I'll show you if I don't. I can buy soap and starch, and we are obliged to keep fire, And washing clothes at 75 cents a dozen isn't unprofitable business. Besides, I can't find anything else to do. If it isn't a whatsoever, I don't know what you would call it." "Well," said Tom, after regarding her speechlessly for a few minutes, "I don't know but it is. It is one that requires rather more moral courage than car driving, I believe, and it only goes to prove to me that if you should take up that motto you would carry it out with power. But, Maria, I tell you, you have skipped several. I wish you would begin at the beginning." "Well, I will," said Maria, energetically. "I'm not afraid of it. I've always believed that genuine religion, that which accomplishes the work in this world, was just going with energy what was set before one to do. I'm willing to try it. I haven't the least idea what they say, but I'm not afraid of them. Shall I take them as they come?" "That is the way I am doing," said Tom, with shining eyes. "Very well. You say you are a whatsoever Christian. I'll be a whatsoever woman, and we'll see how far apart we'll keep. I'll look up the first one as soon as I have time." End of Chapter 28. End of Household Puzzles by Pansy. Recording by TriciaG. Thank you for reading with me.